Thank you. Gentleman here, and then I'll come back to the lady there. Yes, 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 yeah, sure. Quickly, please. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is D.R. Kanal from Nepal. When Chair was raising 2 to 3 issues, probably one was dualism. And in that also one dimension that was informal sector. What I think is that within the informal sector also the illicit activities are much more predominant, and which are probably interlinked partly with the crony capitalism. And that too, again, I think is that the kind of production cost as well as the transaction cost that rises over time because of so many underlying reasons that may have some sort of discouragement to the private sector. And from that standpoint, probably the paper which has very much focused on 2 issues, that is policies and then institutional dimensions, probably the time has come to totally review the policies and the institutional aspects so that more genuine private sector development that could take place. Thank you.
Thank you. Sanjay. Sorry, just one second. Before I come to you, can I just go right at the back? The gentleman there.
Pink shirt.
Yeah. Pink shirt. And it will really help if I can see some hand. Okay. Yeah.
I'm Dev Nathan from the Institute for Human Development, India, and also Duke University, US. I think there's one topic which needs to be brought into the forefront, and only the speaker from the Commonwealth Secretariat slightly mentioned it, the question of innovation. Without innovation, you can't be competitive. There's a limit to what you can get within existing value chains. As Professor Soban said yesterday, the chains are dominated by the lead firms. So unless you set up your lead firms with your innovations, you can't go very far. 2 big areas where India disrupted the world market were because of innovations. That is the generic drugs market, and the other is the IT software services. But they were both based on process innovations. But we have to move forward even to product innovations, which give you rents over a long period of time. So I think we need to, I would even suggest that the next economic summit should really focus on what do we need to make South Asia a hub for innovation, not just people coming and setting up R&D centers here because we have a lot of scientists and engineers, but itself going into becoming a centers for manufacturing and taking forward these innovations.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll carry on with the questions, Sanjay. And then please, my panel members, if I can request you to note the question that you would like to respond to, then we could do that at the end, because that will just make for a, yeah, I got it.
Thank you, Chair. Sanjay Kathuria from the World Bank. So I'd like to pick up on one aspect which several speakers have brought up, which is the issue of competition. The private sector asks for many things, but they don't welcome competition. They don't ask for competition. And the private sector will do what the private sector does, which is they're in the business of making money, and if in the process the economy benefits, great. And so I think that sort of aspect perhaps needs to come out more in the forefront. There's a very nice paper in the Handbook of South Asia Economics, Gary Purcell, which documents basically the backsliding in the region after, there was a wave of trade policy reforms. There's been a lot of backsliding since the mid-90s and more so in the 2000s. And country after country has indulged in that. So my plea again is that, and also there is a negative or rather ambivalent attitude at best to foreign direct investment in the region. Now, we also have to realize that, FDI or the companies, multinational companies that are no lambs in the wool. They also, once they are there, and if they come up behind protectionist walls, they will also indulge in as much lobbying for protection as the private sector from the domestic side. So they're all part of what the private sector environment does. So my plea is that in many cases, yes, the government should pay attention to what the private sector says, and that's where private sector, public sector dialogue is very important. But in one case, there needs to display enlightened leadership, and that is in the case of providing competition, where the private sector will certainly not plead for, allowing, greater competition. Or so there, a case for enlightened leadership is very important, and I'd like to ask the panel as to how the government can, what kind of forces can encourage government to take those routes, as opposed to what's been happening in South Asia in the last decade or so.
Just to get the balance right, I go to the left now, and which is right at just the gentleman here, yes. Get the right-left balance.
Thank you, Chair. In a forum like this, there's no harm in revisiting the old questions. Yesterday we did about growth and equity or inclusiveness. Today we are doing market, role of market and private sector. There was mention of role of state as a regulator, as facilitator, even Pradeep ji mentioning as competitor with the private sector. My question here is, we've been told that there is too much regulating authorities and we want to get rid of at national levels. But at the same time, we are hearing from panelists that there should be investments, regional investment forum, regional forum for competitiveness, regional forum for corporate social responsibilities. One may think of several other regulatory forum at regional level. Do we want to create more regulating bodies at regional level when we are already thinking of too much regulation at the national level? Shall we not focus on harmonizing policies and creating agreements that really helps us rather than creating regulation at another level?
Thank you. Martin. And we'll come to the panel at the end. Is that all right, sir? Yeah? Yes.
Thanks, Rajiv. Martin Rama, World Bank. Two very quick related questions. It's clear that the region has no shortage of entrepreneurial spirit and dynamism and even greed at sometimes. I want to elaborate on the point on competition and entry that Sanjay and others have emphasized. There was not long ago a study showing that much of the progress of world trade was related to containers more than to trade policies, to the lower cost of transport associated with containers. The equivalent of that question in the region is how much more can we expect from getting through on regulation? As many of you said, for 30 years we have known what needs to be done, and how much can be accomplished through infrastructure and logistics. And the related question is, there are many success stories in the region. You have been telling many stories of frustration, but anything from garments in Bangladesh to automobile industry or pharmaceuticals or software in India. What was the key for these successes? Was it appropriate regulation, competition bodies, or was it just the regulator being caught unaware by something that the private sector was doing?
Thank you. I'll name the next 5, and then we can go accordingly. And I saw Nadeem, Aradhana, Nagesh, Akmal, Mr. Bhatija there, and Mr. Rahmatullah in that order. So I've got them all, I suppose. It's all the writers who want to speak, but that's all right. Writers with left views, Nagesh tells me.
Rightist? Yeah. I'm sorry, I regard myself as a leftist, so sorry, I take exception.
No, not at all.
Anyway, it doesn't. I have just 2 or 3 points to make, very quick, Rajiv.
And we have about 10 minutes for the whole thing.
No.
So
I'll just do even 2 minutes. I'll not even take 2 minutes. Very quickly. First thing is that I was sitting here through the 2 days and now whatever, and I noticed that it's, I think, the 5th speaker, I think Mr. Babar Ali, who came up with the term entrepreneurship. So I was very relieved to hear entrepreneurship, because I think, again, on the topic of defunct economists, I think private sector saw yesterday. Why are we talking about private sector anymore? The new term should be entrepreneurship, and we should focus on entrepreneurship. Because the private sector, one term also that, again, I have not seen today, and we should bring that in, is rent-seeking. The private sector, even in the US now, is seen to be rent-seeking, and we should revise our nomenclature. Still on nomenclature, let me also point out that now we are using another term called crony capitalism. But it's the same thing as yesterday's license Raj. So let's not forget, it's a license Raj that created the crony capitalism and ruled out entrepreneurship. We did an analysis of the Karachi Stock Exchange, and we came to the conclusion that there are hardly any entrepreneurs listed on the Karachi Stock Exchange. And we should think about it. The largest companies in the Karachi Stock Exchange are government-owned companies. So we really need to look at the industrial structure very carefully and think about it very carefully. Even competition policy has to be subject to study of the industrial organization structure in the country. Unfortunately, we have very little of that in these countries. Thank you.
Next, Radhana.
Yeah, I'm Aradhana from the University of Delhi, and my comment is...
louder, please.
My comment is directed to Rajiv himself. A pertinent question is, why is the private sector retrogressive? In the sense that it is not supporting openness, why it is not innovative, why entrepreneurship development is not really taking place in this region. And I think the answer lies in the environment in which the private sector is doing business. And this is coming in particular from the governance. Policy uncertainties, political demands, rent seeking, favoritism, and then bureaucratic attitude towards businesses. I think because of all, and then of course infrastructure, logistics, financial problems. So all these problems actually lead to a business environment which is not really conducive to doing businesses. There are several IIT pass outs who aspire to become entrepreneurs. They start doing they start pursuing their ideas, but after certain years or after a few months only, they leave this idea and they go back to the jobs. So we have to actually address these pertinent issues in the region.
Akmal, thanks, Ran. I thought the job was, right to the back, please. I thought the job of the chairman was just to raise questions, not answer them, but that's good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To address this issue of why the private sector actively prevents regional integration, or some elements of the private sector do that. And I think to get an understanding of this problem, one has to see that the elements, some elements of the private sector are linked up with factions within the government, and even more importantly, with factions in the power structure that underlies government. And so these elements who want to prevent competition at the regional level are precisely the elements who are trying to prevent competition at the national level as well. And the whole purpose of preventing or restricting competition nationally or regionally is to be able to continue to generate the rents that are possible only in a non-competitive environment. And this problem of rent generation is inherently linked with the way political power in our part of the world is constituted. It's done precisely by enabling rents to be generated, making rules and regulations through which individuals and organizations can make rents. And I think this is linked with the underlying power structure as well.
Thank you. So the person at the back, gentleman, right at the back? Yeah. Is that Mr. Bhatija, is it?
Thank you. I'd like to make 2 points.
If you will introduce.
My name is Indrajit Kumarasamy.
Yeah.
You know, one of the key factors that has been undermining competitiveness in the region has been the weak macroeconomic frameworks in most of the countries. If you look at the region in relation to, say, East and Southeast Asia, the successful countries in those regions,
understood.
You have a high inflation, high nominal interest rate, exchange rate, issue. And therefore, you have the kind of exporters, import competing sectors all struggling.
Yeah, the point is made. We're now in a hurry. Yeah.
So in a sense, that's one. And two, in terms of constraints to increasing the investment ratio and attracting FDI, I mean, we've heard about cronyism, corruption, etc. But particularly to pick up on Mr. Mehta's point, in these mixed economies where there is a gray area between the public and private sector, I think consistency and predictability of policies, probably that is the most critical element in terms of constraining the growth in investment. Thank you.
Nagesh. Now I think we're just on the last two now, Nagesh and Mr. Rahmatullah. Doctor. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Chair. Let me begin by complimenting all of the panelists and also the author of the lead paper for raising all these very important issues. All of them are very, very sensible issues. I wanted to pick up this point about capital or availability of credit being a constraint on industrialization and private sector development. And I think the region has some of the very good best practices to be emulated. One of them is development of long-term industrial banks, because the industrial credit cannot be really looked after by commercial banks. They are short-term in approach, and the institutional credit that is to be provided, is to be done by separate kind of institutions. And in that context, India and also Sri Lanka have very good role models to offer. The other thing is that it is a time that we have regional cooperation in industrial credit by linking the capital markets of the region. For instance, companies of the size and stature like Infosys or TCS can go and raise capital anywhere in the world. They have raised actually at New York Stock Exchange. But there are very large entry barriers, very large fixed costs before you could do that. And you should be reputed, large company, globally known, etc., before you can raise that. But that should not prevent them to come to one of the regional exchanges, say Bombay Stock Exchange, where you can, Bangladeshi companies can come and list themselves. And there is a mechanism of ACU which could facilitate convertibility.
Thank you. Last one, please, and let's make it short.
Yeah.
Really appreciate if you could just make it brief. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is addressed to the professor from Nepal. It is true that the transport cost in the South Asia and logistic costs are very high. And Nepal has been facing an adverse situation because they had to use only one port, Kolkata, which is congested. But situation is going to be overcome very soon because there is an understanding between India, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, Bhutan, that Bangladesh port of Mongla and Chittagong both are open to Nepal. Now, rail connectivity has also been allowed to be used by India. So my suggestion would be to Nepali professor is to ask the private sector to get in touch with the Bangladesh private sector as well as the Mongla Port Authority to open up the transport links so that this facility that has been allowed by India can be better used.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now go back to my panel. I've run out of time, but I'll take 5 minutes just that we started late. But Professor Ambassador Subhan.
Well, very briefly, to go back to your original point, Mr. Chairman, is there a role that the private sector can play in promoting and developing regional cooperation in South Asia? Well, obviously, we have to look at the region in comparison to other regions. We have to look at how attractive we've been in bringing in FDI and how attractive have we been in facilitating FDI within the region. And here, clearly, what we need to do, and I think it's self-evident, is we need to improve infrastructure, we need to improve connectivity, we need to take the opportunities that exist in terms of power trade, we need to really leverage the many advantages that exist, which we haven't been able to do. And the question is why? And what do we need to do in order to address these issues?
Well, I'll only add to what Mr. Farooq Subhan has said. I think we need to urge the heads of our government to put their heads together more often.
Good idea.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think there is a tendency, particularly in South Asia, and this is a common across the region, to focus on the negatives and the barriers and what holds us back. And I think one of the things that I think we need to be very conscious of is there is a real appetite for looking at this region right now. There is a real appetite for looking at this region right now. And therefore, it behoves on the region to identify the strongest players to build the case for coming into the region and investing in the region. And I think that and I'm not going to make this point overly, but I think it's important, the Commonwealth Business Forum, the Commonwealth Summit itself, taking place in this very building in 10 weeks' time, $14 billion of business was generated in 72 hours the last time it was held. Now, South Asian companies were not there enough. They were not visible. They were not targeting. I was there last time. I saw delegations from other countries, from Africa, from elsewhere, walk away with significant contracts with business. And what we need to do is ensure that the strongest companies and the strongest players in our region can be a bridge to the other companies as well in the region that are smaller and therefore build a stronger investment platform. Thank you.
We are aware about the opening up of the earlier restricted business centers in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. there has been a lot of efforts already being taken by the private sector. But very recently, the government of Nepal has constituted a high-level economic diplomacy commission comprised of private sector, public sector, academia. So they are working out on the modalities how to go about it. So maybe in future, the problem will be minimized.
Pradeep. And we really run out of time now.
This is what?
Working. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. No, thanks. I came in late, so I couldn't get a call of mine. I think the biggest challenge for our group here is what I hear again and again, that we talk about these issues which have been talked about since 30 years, there's no resolution. So the challenge is, one is, how do we take the horse to the water trough? And having taken the horse to the water trough, how can we ensure that the horse is going to drink the water? So how do we get the policymakers here inside this room to hear what we are saying, rather than to read an outcome of this meeting in a mountain of papers that they have to deal with? Otherwise, we'll continue to talk till the cows come home. Second point I would like to make is relating to what my colleague on my left spoke about, Mr. Shah, that it is important to be competitive domestically before you can compete internationally. I gave the example of cricket, and I'm always reminded that if Milkha Singh had not ran in the Indian competition, he would not have been able to run in the Olympics. The second point, in terms of entrepreneurship, Babar Ali Sahab, why do we restrict entrepreneurship to the private sector? Yesterday, Dr. Rahman Sobhan reminded us of a very extremely successful cooperative venture in India, the Amul Dairy. So I would look at entrepreneurship coming not only from the private sector, the cooperative sector, which is shrinking in many countries, and the third is the public sector. Why do we ignore the fact the public sector cannot be entrepreneurial? In many areas, we've seen even the public sector can be very entrepreneurial.
Thanks.
The last point I would like to make is on regulation. The issue which is often works like a millstone around a neck, and that is what, in fact, creates the field, as Akmal Saab said, of crony capitalism. The idea is to look for optimal regulation, and how do we go about doing that has always been a challenge, and I leave it at that. Thank you.
Shah.
Yeah, I'll leave a thought with all the think tanks. Stop working on economic strategy. It's already in place. Start working on a communication strategy, both in terms of the public service as well as to the private sector. Thank you.
Fantastic. Very good. Ladies and gentlemen, given that I have already flunked my test because I couldn't keep the session in time, I will refrain from saying anything at all on this at the end of this discussion, except to request all of you to give my panelists a really good warm round of applause and to the session. Thank you.